Possibly. I've read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point. I don't know if you guys have ever read it, but he actually talked about how even in today's time, the number one way that things get moved is still word of mouth. And he says still number one today. There's this person who's this innovative person who starts wearing. I think his example was shoes, and I think he brought up how the Converse shoes became popular again, and that was the example. And it's like you have this one weird kid who starts wearing Converse sneakers made out of tennis balls, and all of a sudden, that's what's hip, that's what's cool, and it's innovative, and everybody wants that. And even though, maybe there weren't that many pictures of it out there, people are just talking, and they're saying, hey, did you see that kid with the tennis ball shoes? And the next thing you know, it's word of mouth epidemic all over the place. So I don't know if technology necessarily influences what is hip. I think maybe if you look at the guys, I know like designing websites, right? That would be considered pretty hip, and so that might be different. I think maybe it can change the perception of different types of things that can be hip. But as far as the transmission of hip or the spreading of hip ideas, I think it's still very much that word of mouth, interpersonal connection level, because you kind of have this feeling around this person that has the charisma to spread their idea, that kind of thing on the fringe, and that's how they spread what's hip. It's interesting. If you die young, people always have that if factor. What if Jimi Hendrix made 5 more records? Would they all be as amazing? Would we still think it's cool that he was playing a guitar upside down on fire at the age of 55? What's that going to do? I don't know. Maybe if you die young, I think it definitely helps solidify you as a hip image, because all the pictures of you, all the videos of you, all of the sound clips and audio clips of you are always going to be when you're young. And that's all people are ever going to remember you as, is this kind of young, hip, innovative person. And so, yeah, then maybe they never got to settle into maybe a more mainstream role. We never got to see Jimi Hendrix calm down and stop doing so many drugs. We never got to see him just chill, right? And stop being crazy good at guitar the way he was at such a young age. And so I think if you die young and you're famous and you're seen as a hip person, then yeah, you're solidified as hip, because that's really the only role people knew you as. There's nothing else you can be. Same thing with Tupac Shakur, right? He dies. We always know Tupac as the Tupac. We always know Biggie as the Biggie, that we saw the young guy who was changing music, and that's all we'll ever know him as. We never got to see him as the 40-year-old entrepreneur, businessman who's influencing hip-hop in a different way, the way we see Jay-Z now. Things that are breaking through, things that are changing constantly are usually really hip. Oh, okay, you need to be down, right? Like you need to be real. Looking at different genres, and especially working at a radio station, I hear tons and tons of different types of music. If I just wrote a book that sounded like every other novel ever written, or like just your standard American novel experience, it would be kind of boring, or it would just be another book, but it wouldn't really be hip. Whereas, if you get somebody, I'm trying to think of a great example of someone who's really recently just broken through with some sort of change in prose, like Hemingway. Okay, let's go with Hemingway in the 20s, 30s, 40s. The guy literally changes the way we understand how to write prose. He completely changes the experience of reading an American novel. That's very hip. That to me is the kind of thing you would have to do to make literature hip. It has to be kind of on the cusp, on the fringe of things as well.
I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this question.
It's about credibility, right? Like you have to have your credibility. You have to have something underlying this perception of you. And Hemingway really, he was talented. His books are entertaining. They change things. That's why people would look at him and say, oh, he was this great writer. Because the way he switched things up, the way he was able to be hip. Reverence, I'm not so sure about. I mean, I think about Jack Kerouac, the hipster, the hip writer of the Beat generation, and he's unappreciated for most of his life until On the Road blows up later in his literary career, right before he drinks himself to death. He's this amazing guy, and then it dips away for a while. Then it comes back, and people appreciate it again, and now it's just this kind of cult classic-y novel that people enjoy. But to me, he changed it. He changed literature too. Just the way he wrote was so just out there that it was innovative and people liked it. And I think that's part of being hip. There are people who think that nothing that ever gets famous can be hip. which isn't really the case. I think Ernest Hemingway and Kerouac, Kerouac is the definition of a hipster. Will always be hip, Kerouac especially. So even though now, he's one of the most famous authors in American history, and for good reason, I still think he's hip. I still think anyone that picks up On the Road or the Dharma Bums will read those books and say, my goodness, this is really different, this style. It's driving me crazy, but I love it. It's really hip and enjoyable. So I don't necessarily think that something has to be undiscovered for a long period of time. I think something can be popular in its time and be hip. I mean, just going back to music again, because this is the great example is like Tupac, and Biggie, two definitions of hip, the embodiment of hip really, and Tupac. And this is a guy who's huge, widely famous, selling tons of records even way before his death. Ali and his disease, it's really a tragedy. It's caused him to retire. And I was writing about Ali the other day, just kind of in remembrance of him. And I was writing, and the way I described it, his inability to speak as much as he did, I called it was like a hole had been torn in the face of a portrait. And it's kind of like this missing, just the whole central has been taken from him to some degree, and it's heartbreaking because he can't be the guy that he was. So I think, that's why you just don't see video of Ali anymore. No one really wants to put that out there because it's really heartbreaking. So that's why all the focus is always on this era of him, really in the 60s, the black and white video era. No one really ever pays attention to his career in the 70s when he was slowing down, when he didn't speak out as much. Really,